You wake up in the middle of the night and suddenly everything feels different. The silence around you isn't just silence anymore. It's pregnant with presence, thick with the weight of eternity pressing against the thin veil of ordinary time. The moonlight streaming through your window isn't just light, it's a gentle reminder that something immense is watching over this world, something that has been here long before you were born and will remain long after you're gone. You feel it in your bones, this sense that you're part of a vast cosmic story, that your life is threaded through with meaning and purpose that extends far beyond your daily concerns. But when you try to share this feeling with someone the next day, their eyes glaze over. They change the subject, or worse, they look at you with that mixture of pity and discomfort that says they think you're losing touch with reality. You've tried explaining it, this sensation that the world is full of meaning, that every moment contains a hidden sacred dimension, but the words always fall flat. They talk about brain chemistry and stress levels, about the need to stay grounded and practical. You begin to wonder if you're going crazy, if this deep knowing that life is mysteriously holy is just your imagination running wild, if the voices of skepticism around you are right, and you need to get your feet back on solid ground. What if I told you that this experience, this ability to perceive the sacred threading through ordinary existence, isn't madness, but recognition? What if the very thing that makes you feel isolated from others is actually evidence that you're awakening to something most people have forgotten how to see? What if your sensitivity to the sacred dimension of reality places you in a lineage of human consciousness that stretches back to the very beginning of our species? There's a profound loneliness that comes with perceiving reality differently than everyone around you. A loneliness that cuts deeper than ordinary social isolation because it touches the very core of how you experience existence itself. Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade understood this isolation intimately. He spent his life studying what he called homo religiosus, the religious human being who lived in constant awareness of the sacred dimension of existence, for whom every tree, stone, and moment in time could become a doorway to the transcendent. According to Eliade, this type of person once dominated human consciousness, seeing the world as alive with divine presence, experiencing reality as a living tapestry where the ordinary and extraordinary were constantly interpenetrating each other. For the Homo religiosus, a mountain wasn't just a geological formation but a cosmic pillar connecting earth and heaven, what ancient traditions called the axis mundi, the center of the world where divine communication could occur. A forest wasn't just a collection of trees but a sacred precinct where spirits dwelled and gods might appear. Time itself had texture and depth, with certain moments being qualitatively different from others, infused with creative power and divine presence. But something happened. Modernity stripped this sacred vision from most people's eyes, replacing it with what Eliade termed profane time and profane space. A flattened reality where nothing points beyond itself, where the material world is all there is, where meaning becomes something humans impose on reality rather than discover within it. If you're someone who still catches glimpses of the sacred, who experiences those moments when ordinary reality seems to become transparent to something deeper, you're living as a homo religiosus in a world of secular minds, and this creates a unique form of spiritual exile that few people understand. You're carrying ancient eyes into a modern world, perceiving patterns and meanings that our culture has taught most people to ignore or dismiss. The experience of seeing reality differently isn't new, and understanding this history can provide immense comfort for those who feel isolated in their spiritual perceptions. Throughout history, mystics, shamans, visionaries, and spiritual seekers have always existed on the margins of their societies, perceiving patterns and meanings invisible to ordinary consciousness, serving as bridges between the visible and invisible worlds. What Eliade discovered through his extensive research across cultures and centuries was that this wasn't just the domain of professional religious people or exceptional individuals. Ancient humans naturally lived in sacred time and sacred space as their default mode of consciousness. They understood that certain places were hierophanies, manifestations of the sacred, where the divine broke through into ordinary reality like sunlight streaming through a window in a dark room. A mountain wasn't just rock and earth, it was an axis mundi, a cosmic pillar connecting heaven and earth, a place where prayers could ascend and blessings could descend. A grove wasn't just trees, It was a sacred precinct where gods might appear, where the veil between worlds grew thin enough for communication with the transcendent. A spring wasn't just water. It was a gift from the Earth Mother, a source of life and healing that connected the human community to the divine source of all abundance. Time itself had texture and depth, with certain moments being qualitatively different from others, infused with creative power and divine presence. The time of planting wasn't just a practical agricultural decision, but a participation in the eternal act of creation, a repetition of the gods' original work of bringing life from death, order from chaos. The time of harvest wasn't just gathering crops, but celebrating the earth's generosity and acknowledging humanity's dependence on forces far greater than individual effort. But modern consciousness has lost this sensitivity. We've gained technological mastery over the physical world at the cost of our ability to perceive its spiritual dimensions. We've learned to manipulate matter while forgetting how to commune with the spirit that animates matter. We've developed incredible precision in measuring and predicting physical phenomena while losing our capacity to perceive the sacred patterns that give meaning to those phenomena. When you're someone who still experiences these sacred dimensions, you carry an ancient form of consciousness into a modern world that has no vocabulary for what you perceive, no framework for validating your experience, and often active hostility toward the very possibility that reality contains spiritual dimensions. You might find yourself moved to tears by a sunset not just because it's beautiful, but because it feels like a direct communication from something infinitely larger than yourself. A love letter written across the sky in languages of color and light. You might sense that certain places hold memory and presence, that the old church or forest grove or even corner of your bedroom can become charged with spiritual significance, humming with an energy that makes your heart race and your soul feel suddenly awake. You might experience what Eliade called the myth of eternal return, moments when linear time seems to dissolve and you're participating in something timeless and recurring, when your personal story becomes part of a much larger cosmic narrative that has been unfolding since the beginning of time. You might find yourself drawn to rituals and practices that create sacred space and sacred time, lighting candles not just for illumination, but for the way flame connects earth and heaven. Walking in nature not just for exercise, but for the deep communion with living presence that happens when you allow yourself to truly listen to the world around you. These experiences aren't hallucinations or wishful thinking or compensations for psychological inadequacy. They're recoveries of human capacity that modern education and secular culture have systematically trained out of us. The restoration of perceptual abilities that our ancestors took for granted as part of normal human consciousness. You're not becoming delusional when you perceive these sacred dimensions. You're becoming more fully human in ways that most people have forgotten are possible. The problem isn't with your perception, but with a culture that has convinced most people that spiritual experience is either primitive superstition or psychological dysfunction, leaving no middle ground for the simple recognition that reality contains layers of meaning and presence that escape purely rational analysis. The price of this perception is real and often overwhelming, affecting every aspect of how you move through the world and relate to other people. When you try to share what you see, people often respond with skepticism, concern, or that polite but firm redirection that tells you the conversation is over before it really begins. They've been taught that reality consists only of what can be measured and reproduced in laboratories. That subjective experience is unreliable and probably self-deceptive. That spiritual perceptions are either mental illness waiting to be diagnosed or childhood fantasies that mature people outgrow. The sacred dimension you perceive doesn't fit into their framework of acceptable experience, and rather than expanding their framework, they prefer to conclude that your experience is invalid. This creates a profound sense of alienation that goes beyond ordinary loneliness because it questions the very foundation of your perception and judgment. You might feel like you're speaking a language no one else understands, carrying knowledge that feels essential, but which others dismiss as fantasy or delusion. You start editing yourself, learning to hide the moments when you feel most alive and connected, because sharing them leads to awkward silences or worried suggestions that you might need professional help. The modern world offers no vocabulary for discussing hierophanies or sacred time, or the ways that ordinary reality can suddenly become transparent to transcendent meaning. Psychology pathologizes spiritual experiences, reducing them to brain chemistry and evolutionary holdovers from primitive thinking. Science ignores subjective dimensions of reality, insisting that only measurable phenomena deserve serious attention. Popular culture turns the sacred into entertainment or commodity, stripping it of depth and power. You're left holding a form of awareness that feels true and vital, but which the dominant culture treats as irrelevant or dangerous, something to be medicated away or therapied into submission. The isolation becomes deeper when you realize that even people who claim to be spiritual often want spirituality without transcendence, meaning without mystery, connection without any real challenge to their fundamental assumptions about reality. You find yourself caught between secular materialism that denies the sacred altogether and shallow spirituality that turns it into another consumer product designed to make people feel better about themselves. You know what touches me most when I read your messages? It's realizing that we're not alone in this search. If you're listening to me now and feel that emptiness, that sensation that something important is missing in your life, I want you to know that I understand exactly what you're going through. There were moments when I also felt completely disconnected from the sacred, lost in the midst of a routine that seemed to suck all the magic out of existence. That's why I want to ask you a very direct question. What was the last moment you felt there was something greater than yourself present in your life? It could have been contemplating a sunset, listening to music, or simply in an instant of silence. If you feel comfortable, write in the comments, "I miss the sacred in my daily life," and briefly tell when that last moment was. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone in this journey. And I promise I'll read each comment with the care it deserves. But this isolation, painful as it is, also contains a gift. Eliade believed that those who maintain contact with the sacred dimension serve as bridges between worlds. You carry forward an essential human capacity that civilization desperately needs to recover. Your ability to perceive meaning and presence in the natural world, to sense the sacred qualities of time and space, represents a form of consciousness that predates and transcends the limiting assumptions of secular materialism. When you feel that pull toward the transcendent, when you sense that ordinary moments contain extraordinary depth, you're not losing your grip on reality, you're recovering contact with deeper layers of reality that most people have learned to ignore. The challenge is learning to trust this perception while functioning in a world that doesn't validate it. Eliade's research shows that the sacred dimension doesn't disappear just because modern consciousness refuses to acknowledge it. Hierophanies still occur. Sacred time still breaks through linear time. The axis mundi, that cosmic center where earth and heaven meet, can still be discovered in unexpected places. But recognizing these experiences requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to trust your deepest intuitions, even when they contradict the prevailing worldview. It means accepting that you might always live somewhat on the margins, carrying ancient wisdom into a forgetful world. If you like this exploration, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people discover these ideas, and your support means everything to me as we dive deeper into these profound concepts together. This marginality also creates opportunities. Because you haven't fully bought into the secular worldview, you remain open to experiences and insights that escape others. You might notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggest reality has patterns invisible to purely rational analysis. You might feel called to engage in practices that create sacred time and sacred space, rituals and contemplations that restore your connection to the transcendent dimension. You might find yourself drawn to ancient wisdom traditions that validate your experience of a multi-layered reality. These aren't escapes from the real world, but engagements with aspects of reality that modernity has forgotten. Learning to inhabit this position gracefully requires developing what we might call bilingual consciousness, a sophisticated ability to move fluidly between different modes of perception depending on what each situation requires. You learn to speak the language of secular culture when necessary, while maintaining your private connection to sacred reality, like someone who is fluent in multiple languages and can switch between them effortlessly. You develop skills for creating sacred space within profane environments, turning your morning coffee ritual into a moment of gratitude and presence, finding moments of sacred time within the linear progression of clock time, recognizing that even a few minutes of deep breathing can open doorways to transcendent awareness. You learn to read the subtle signs that indicate whether someone else might be open to deeper conversation, developing intuition about when to share your perceptions and when to simply hold them privately. You learn to recognize others who share this deeper perception, creating communities of understanding that support your spiritual development without isolating you from the larger world. Most importantly, you learn to trust the validity of your experience even when it conflicts with dominant cultural narratives, developing the inner strength to maintain your connection to sacred reality, regardless of external validation or approval. This isn't about becoming secretive or dishonest, but about developing the wisdom to know when and how to share the depth of your perception in ways that serve others, rather than simply confirming your own insights. You become skilled at planting seeds of spiritual possibility, without overwhelming people who aren't ready for such conversations, learning to ask questions that invite others to examine their own experiences of transcendence and meaning. The ancient traditions Eliade studied offer guidance for this kind of life. They understood that sacred reality doesn't impose itself on unwilling consciousness. It must be invited, cultivated, and honored. They developed practices for maintaining contact with the transcendent dimension while fulfilling worldly responsibilities. They created rituals for marking the transitions between profane and sacred consciousness. They established communities where different levels of spiritual sensitivity were recognized and supported. These traditions understood that seeing reality differently isn't a burden to be cured, but a gift to be developed. Your sensitivity to the sacred dimension also positions you to serve as a translator between worlds, helping bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding in ways that can be profoundly healing for both yourself and others. Because you understand both secular and sacred consciousness, because you've learned to navigate the practical demands of modern life while maintaining contact with transcendent reality, you can help others recognize the spiritual dimensions of their own experience without asking them to abandon their rational faculties or adopt belief systems that feel foreign to their temperament. You might find that people are more hungry for this perspective than they initially appear, that beneath the surface, skepticism lies a deep longing for meaning and connection that purely materialistic worldviews cannot satisfy. When you share your perceptions skillfully, without forcing or proselytizing, without claiming special status or superior understanding, you offer others permission to trust their own deeper intuitions, to pay attention to those moments when they too sense something larger moving through their lives. You become what Eliade might call a hierophant, someone who reveals the sacred to those ready to see it, not through dramatic proclamations, but through the simple act of living authentically from sacred awareness. Your very existence as someone who manages to maintain spiritual sensitivity while functioning effectively in the modern world serves as proof that these apparently contradictory approaches to reality can be integrated. You demonstrate that spiritual awareness doesn't require retreating from the world, but can actually enhance your capacity to engage with life more fully, with greater depth of feeling and clearer perception of what truly matters. People watch how you move through challenges and celebrations, how you maintain equanimity in chaos and find meaning in ordinary moments. And they begin to sense that there might be resources available to them that they haven't yet learned to access. The world needs people who can perceive sacred reality now more than ever, as we face crises that purely technological and economic solutions cannot address. Environmental crises, social fragmentation, widespread psychological distress, and the epidemic of meaninglessness that characterizes modern life all reflect in part our collective loss of connection to the transcendent dimension of existence. When humans perceive nature as mere resource rather than sacred presence, when trees become nothing more than potential lumber, and mountains become nothing more than obstacles to development or sources of extractable materials, ecological destruction becomes not just possible, but inevitable. When time becomes nothing but linear progression toward profit and productivity, when every moment must be monetized and optimized and stripped of contemplative depth, life loses its organic rhythm and meaning, leading to the burnout and anxiety that plague so many people today. When space becomes nothing but geometry rather than charged with spiritual significance, when places are valued only for their economic potential rather than their capacity to nourish the human spirit, communities fragment, and individuals become isolated atoms bouncing against each other without deeper connection. Your ability to perceive these sacred dimensions offers healing possibilities that go far beyond personal spiritual development. You see forests as living communities deserving respect and care, not just carbon storage systems or timber resources. You experience time as having natural cycles and rhythms that need to be honored, not just units to be filled with productive activity. You recognize that certain places hold special significance and need to be protected, not for their economic value, but for their spiritual importance to human well-being. This perspective doesn't make you impractical or naive about the challenges facing modern society, but it does provide you with resources for addressing those challenges from a deeper place than pure technological manipulation or economic calculation. This doesn't mean you need to become a teacher or spiritual leader. Simply living from sacred consciousness creates ripples. When you treat certain places as holy, you help preserve their spiritual potency. When you honor sacred time through ritual and contemplation, you maintain openings between the transcendent and mundane worlds. When you recognize the sacred in other people, you help them remember their own spiritual depth. Your very existence as someone who perceives reality differently serves as evidence that alternative ways of seeing are possible. The loneliness of this path is real, but it's not permanent. Eliade's research reveals that throughout history, those who maintain contact with sacred reality have always found each other. They create networks of understanding that transcend conventional social boundaries. They develop languages and practices for sharing their deeper perceptions. They establish traditions that preserve and transmit sacred consciousness across generations. You're part of this lineage whether you recognize it or not. Every time you trust your intuition that reality contains more than physical matter and mechanical processes, you align yourself with countless generations of humans who have perceived the same sacred dimensions. The price of seeing reality before everyone else is real, but so is the privilege. You get to live in a world alive with meaning and presence. You experience moments of connection to something infinitely larger than your individual consciousness. You participate in the great human adventure of discovering the sacred dimensions of existence. These experiences don't make you better than others, but they do make you responsible for preserving and sharing this ancient human capacity. In a world increasingly disconnected from its spiritual roots, your perception serves as a bridge back to wholeness. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes that there's a different path, a deeper way to understand your own spiritual journey. I know what it's like to feel lost amid so much noise of the modern world, seeking answers that always seem to slip through your fingers. That's why I created this space, this refuge where we can explore together the ancient wisdom that still pulses alive in our hearts. When you subscribe to this channel, you're not just clicking a button, you're joining a community of people who, like you, feel that life has deeper layers waiting to be discovered. Here you'll find not just knowledge, but genuine embrace for your thirst for meaning. Subscribe now and be part of this journey of rediscovering the sacred in everyday life. Your soul deserves this gift. Remember that your sensitivity to sacred reality isn't a psychological problem to be solved, but a spiritual gift to be cultivated. The isolation you sometimes feel isn't evidence that you're wrong about what you perceive, but proof that you're seeing something most people have learned to ignore. The challenge isn't to become more normal, but to become more skillful at navigating between sacred and secular consciousness. Trust your deepest perceptions while developing the wisdom to share them appropriately. The world needs your vision more than you know. In seeing reality differently, you offer everyone the possibility of recovering what Eliade called the religious dimension of human existence. That capacity to experience life as sacred, meaningful, and eternally significant. This isn't just your personal spiritual journey, but your contribution to humanity's remembering of who we really are beneath the surface identities modern culture offers us. The price you pay for seeing reality first is also the gift you give to a world ready to remember its own sacred nature.